I come to the floor today because I am concerned about President Trump's actions to, I believe, start a trade war with our top two trading partners, Canada and Mexico. All goods coming from Canada and Mexico, as of midnight last night, I guess midnight today, face a 25% tax. That is all except Canadian energy, which is taxed at 10%. Trump's tariffs will make everything from gas to heating to groceries to lumber and more expensive for everyday Americans. And I think it bears repeating that tariffs are paid by consumers. They're paid by Americans, not by other countries. And what the president is doing amounts to a new tax for Americans. For example, heating oil and propane that keeps hundreds of thousands of Granite Staters warm in the winter is going to cost more. We're going to add about $150 to $250 to the cost of heating homes in New Hampshire. And gas prices are going to go up. In New Hampshire, half of the fuel in our cars and trucks comes from Canada, and U.S. refineries across the Midwest use Canadian oil. The U.S. imports 80% of its potash fertilizer from Canada, and this tariff makes farming and food more expensive. It's unclear how the American auto industry is going to continue to operate. Ford's CEO said these tariffs will, and I quote, blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen, with up to $12,000 added to the cost of the car. And this will make lumber and electrical equipment that we need to build housing at a time when housing is already in short supply. It will make them more expensive and harder to find. Those are just a few examples. There are countless other imports that American businesses and families rely on that are going to be hit hard. And these tariffs do nothing to bring down those costs. They do just the opposite. These tariffs could add $1,200 to an average household's yearly costs. And we won't have to wait very long for the impact to be felt. It's already being felt on Wall Street and the stock market. Target's CEO said this morning that the consumer, and I quote, will likely see price increases over the next couple of days. And for small businesses, these tariff taxes will be felt by small businesses in all of our states. I was here a month ago today sharing stories from business owners in New Hampshire who weren't sure how they were going to keep operating if specialized machinery that they can only get from Canada suddenly costs 25% more. And since that time, I've heard from even more people in New Hampshire, more small businesses. Last week, I heard from a small company in Windham, New Hampshire. It makes allergen-free cookies, and they can only get certain ingredients for those cookies from Canada. The CEO built her business, which now employs 30 people, and now she can't be sure if they're even going to be able to keep going, let alone keep growing. When I spoke with business representatives across New Hampshire last month, the theme they kept coming back to was uncertainty. As a former small business owner, I know that uncertainty is the most destabilizing aspect of running and growing a business. Yet, that's what this administration keeps creating. Yesterday, we learned that new orders from manufacturers dropped in February for the first time in 22 years. For the first time in 22 years, new orders from manufacturers dropped because companies can't work with this level of uncertainty. Last Wednesday, the president was talking about Canadian tariffs going into effect April 2nd. The very next morning, he announced 25% tariffs would go into effect today. The whiplash is hard to imagine. I spoke last month about a bus company, C&J Bus Lines in New Hampshire, that was worried about these tariffs and what it would mean for their bottom line. Well, the CEO moved up his delivery date to get 3 buses in late March before these taxes were set to go into effect. But his costs just went up more than $450,000. Businesses plan months, quarters, or years in advance. They need to place orders and plot out their growth in order to succeed. How can they plan when they can't even know whether their costs are going to go up 25% overnight? How can a developer know if they can start building the housing that New Hampshire desperately needs if their lumber costs 25% more overnight? And how can a family already struggling with high costs continue to pay the rent or put food on the table if their household costs are going to go up $1,200 this year? I want families and businesses to know that the whims of this president are not going to cause them to break the bank on everyday items they need to get by. That's why I introduced the Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes on Imported Goods Act. It's a simple change, really. It says that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, can no longer be used to place taxes on imports. If the president needs to block some dangerous product, he still can. But if there's a real threat, we'd want to stop it, not just add a tariff tax. That's what my bill does. It would stop these tariffs on goods and energy coming from Canada and Mexico, and it would give businesses and families more certainty to plan for the future and to keep their hard-earned dollars in their pockets. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-151 and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. Reserving the right to object. IEPA is a powerful tool that provides the President with a range of authorities to protect our national security. With all the challenges facing our nation, now is not the time to be limiting presidential power. And that's exactly what Senator Shaheen's bill would do. Instead, we must use every tool available to combat these threats. And we are already seeing results. As an example, Colombia accepts migrant return flights. We have seen Mexico and Canada take initial credible steps to combat fentanyl and illegal immigration. Now is not the time to tie the hands of President Trump. Thank you, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in the Senate through regular order to ensure that we take every step to protect our national security. I object.
Action is heard.
I know that my colleague from Oregon wants to speak to this issue, but I just want to respond in a couple of ways, and I know my colleague from South Carolina cares about the issues that I'm going to address. But he mentioned fentanyl, and that's what the president has used to justify the tariffs. He says this is a way to stop the flow of fentanyl into our country. But he's forgotten a few inconvenient facts. First, it is that in 2024, CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, seized about 43 pounds of fentanyl along our northern border, about 1% of the fentanyl coming into this country. Now, it's long been known that fentanyl is not coming from Canada and that hard drugs and firearms flow north from the U.S. into Canada. In fact, on February 25th, the Canada Border Services Agency announced the seizure of 410 pounds of methamphetamine and 42 pounds of cocaine from 2 commercial trucks seeking entry into Canada at the Coutts Port of Entry. Seizures like this are not uncommon, and wouldn't it make more sense if we agreed to work together with our Canadian allies instead of putting a tariff on it? The second fact that bears mentioning is that the vast majority of the fentanyl crossing the southwest border is transported by Americans hidden in their cars and trucks. That's why I've supported, like most of my colleagues in this body, have supported more funding for technology and personnel to better find these drugs before they enter the U.S. It's why I supported the border bill last year that this president stopped because he wanted a political issue. And on China, we can debate another time whether this is actually the right long-term strategy with China. But more important than that, my bill does not prevent tariffs against countries like China that have unfair trade practices. Both President Trump in his first term and President Biden have already placed tariffs on numerous imports from China to respond to its unfair trade practices, exactly what Section 301 of the Trade Act is for. That tool remains available. My bill only addresses the ability of the president to tax imports on a whim. And I want to note, thanks to this president, We now have higher taxes on imports from Canada than from China. I don't know how that makes sense, that we are taxing our allies more than we're taxing our adversaries. So I would say, is this really about China? Or is a more important motivation here to raise costs on American families to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy? And as the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I take very seriously our ability to use sanctions or other tools in foreign policy. This bill does nothing to limit the use of sanctions under IEEPA, nor does it prevent an embargo or fully blocking dangerous imports. But I don't think a tax is the right solution for those issues. In fact, this is breaking the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement that President Trump negotiated just 6 years ago. And if we're going to break the very deal we've negotiated, one of the, I think, most important achievements of the first Trump administration, why would people want to work with us in the future? Why would they want to work with a Trump administration? How does being an unreliable partner to our closest allies help our national security? And I think it's important to be clear on this. Donald Trump's trade war doesn't create any manufacturing jobs tomorrow in the U.S. In fact, it's far more likely to cost us tens or hundreds of thousands of jobs. Half of the goods that America imports are intermediate components, and that means that they're parts that our companies manufacture into finished goods. Every one of those items coming from Canada or Mexico just got 25% more expensive. And we've already heard from automakers, they're not sure how much this is going to add to the bottom line of cars. I think that's a lot at risk for tariffs that President Trump can't justify for any other reason other than because he wants to get funding to support a tax cut for the wealthiest Americans. And yet the president is talking about wanting to cut deals with Russia for economic development. I don't see the logic in going halfway around the world to deal with a dictator, a murderous dictator, by the way, like Vladimir Putin. At the same time, we're damaging relationships and cutting off trade with our closest allies right here in North America. I'm happy to listen to somebody's explanation here, but I don't think it makes sense, and it seems entirely contrary to American values to me. So I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will see the folly in what the president is doing, will recognize the impact on the economy and American families because of these increased costs, and agree that these tariffs should be rolled back. Thank you, Madam President. I yield.